What if I told you NATO might not survive the next decade? For over 70 years, it has been the backbone of global security, defending the free world from tyranny. But now, cracks are forming. The U.S. is questioning its commitment, Europe is divided, Russia is advancing, and China? Watching, waiting, preparing. If NATO falls, what happens next? A stronger Europe? A new global alliance? Or total chaos? Let's break it down. It's 1949. The world is still recovering from World War II. Cities lie in ruins, economies are shattered, millions are displaced. But amidst the wreckage, one thing is clear. A new conflict is emerging. The Soviet Union, once an ally against Nazi Germany, is now expanding its influence. Stalin's Red Army has taken control of Eastern Europe. From Poland to East Germany, from Hungary to Czechoslovakia, one by one, nations fall under Soviet control. And in the West, fear grows. The United States knows that if it does nothing, communism will spread further. Western Europe, weak and defenseless, could be next. That's when NATO is born, a historic alliance, a military pact, a simple but powerful idea. Attack one and you attack all. For the first time in history, the U.S. commits to defending Europe. 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, vowing to stand together against Soviet aggression. As the Cold War unfolds, NATO grows. West Germany joins, Greece and Turkey follow. By the 1980s, NATO stands as a bulwark against Soviet power. NATO's presence prevents war in Europe for decades. And then, everything changes. The Soviet Union collapses, the Berlin Wall falls. Eastern Europe is free, and suddenly, people start asking a dangerous question. Does the world still need NATO? Some believe NATO has served its purpose. The Cold War is over. Russia is weak. The U.S. is the world's sole superpower. Even American presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama talk about reducing U.S. commitments. Then, fast forward to 2014. Russia invades Crimea. The world watches as Russian troops annex Ukrainian territory with little resistance. Still, many doubt Russia will go further. But then, 2022, Putin makes his move, and suddenly, that question, does the world still need NATO? Has a very different answer. February 24th. In the dead of night, Russian missiles rain down on Ukraine. Putin's tanks roll toward Kiev. Cities burn. Civilians flee. The world is stunned. This isn't Crimea. This isn't a small-scale operation. This is a full-scale invasion. The West responds. Sanctions hit. Billions in military aid flow to Ukraine. But behind the scenes, Europe is terrified. Suddenly, NATO nations realize something. If Putin can take Ukraine, what's stopping him from going further? The Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are right next door. Poland, Romania, once behind the Iron Curtain, are now NATO members. But if Russia invades, will NATO actually fight? That's when NATO makes its move. Troops flood into Eastern Europe. U.S. tanks roll into Poland. British forces reinforce Estonia. NATO fighter jets patrol the skies. And for the first time in history, Finland and Sweden, neutral for decades, rush to join NATO. Because the truth is simple. Without NATO, Europe is defenseless. Without NATO, Putin could strike anywhere. And here's the worst part. Russia isn't the only threat. There's another superpower watching closely. While NATO strengthens its position in Europe, another power is rising, China, a nation that has spent decades quietly preparing for global dominance. For years, the world thought China was just an economic powerhouse, that it was focused on business, trade, and manufacturing. But behind the scenes, Beijing was playing a much deeper game. First, military expansion. China has built artificial islands in the South China Sea, turning reefs into military bases. They've expanded their navy, now the largest in the world. They've developed hypersonic missiles that can evade U.S. defense systems. Then, economic infiltration. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has poured billions into Africa, Latin America, and Asia. They fund infrastructure projects, but there's a catch: debt. Nations that can't repay are forced to bow to Beijing's demands. Finally, political warfare. China is influencing governments, media, and even universities across the world. And here's where it gets dangerous. While NATO focuses on Russia, China is building its own alliances. Deals with Russia, partnerships in the Middle East, growing influence in Africa. Beijing is pulling nations away from the U.S. And the biggest question, can NATO adapt to this new reality? Because make no mistake, China isn't just watching, they're planning. NATO is strong, but it's not unbreakable. And if history has taught us anything, it's that alliances are only as strong as their weakest links. Right now, NATO has two major weaknesses. First, unequal burden sharing. The U.S. spends more on defense than every other NATO country combined. Meanwhile, major European powers like Germany and France still hesitate to meet their defense commitments. Despite constant warnings, some nations refuse to hit the agreed-upon 2% of GDP defense spending target. Second, internal divisions. Let's talk about Turkey, a NATO member, but one that buys weapons from Russia, one that cozies up to China, one that blocks Sweden's NATO membership for months, and worst of all, one that is increasingly seen as playing both sides. How long can NATO survive if some of its members aren't truly loyal? Since its founding, NATO has relied on one thing: U.S. leadership, American soldiers, American weapons, American money. The U.S. bankrolls the alliance, spending more on defense than all other NATO members combined. For decades, this was never in question. The Cold War, NATO was essential. 1911, NATO backed the U.S. in Afghanistan. But today, a new question is rising. Why should America keep paying for Europe's security? In 2016, Donald Trump called NATO obsolete. He questioned why the U.S. should protect Europe while Germany and France underfunded their own militaries. Trump even hinted that if NATO countries didn't pay their fair share, the U.S. might not come to their defense. It was a warning shot. When Biden took office, he tried to repair NATO relations. He reassured allies. He increased U.S. military presence in Eastern Europe. But the damage was done. For the first time, Europe realized America's commitment isn't guaranteed. And now, with the 2024 election approaching, everything is up in the air. If Trump returns, will he pull the U.S. back from NATO? Will he cut funding, withdraw troops, leave Europe to defend itself? Because here's the reality. If America steps away, NATO collapses. And if NATO collapses, the entire world order changes. Europe would scramble to build its own military defenses. Russia would see an opening, testing NATO's resolve. China would seize the moment, expanding its influence even further. The global balance of power would shift overnight. So the real question isn't just whether NATO will survive, it's whether America wants it to. No matter what happens next, one thing is certain. NATO is at a crossroads. Three futures are possible. Scenario 1, NATO grows even stronger. Europe finally steps up. Germany increases defense spending. France expands its military. Finland and Sweden, the newest NATO members, bring fresh strength to the alliance. The U.S. remains committed, doubling down on its military presence in Europe. NATO doesn't just survive, it expands. It strengthens its hold in Eastern Europe. It builds closer ties with nations in the Indo-Pacific, countering both Russia and China. In this future, NATO becomes a true global alliance. But what if the opposite happens? Scenario 2, NATO fractures. The U.S. pulls back. Some European nations refuse to meet their defense commitments. Internal disputes weaken unity. Turkey continues playing both sides, cozying up to Russia and China. France and Germany hesitate to confront threats head-on. With division inside NATO, Russia pushes deeper into Ukraine. China extends its reach into Europe's economy, buying influence, controlling industries. Without a united front, NATO weakens, and its enemies take advantage. Then there's the most radical future of all. Scenario 3, a new global order. In this world, NATO fades into history. Why? Because China builds a rival alliance. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization expands, bringing in Russia, Iran, and developing nations across Asia and Africa. China uses its economic power to turn former U.S. allies against Washington. The world splits into two competing blocs, just like in the Cold War. But this time, the U.S. is no longer the dominant superpower. So the real question is, which path will we take? Will NATO adapt, or will it fade into irrelevance? And if NATO disappears, what replaces it? Let's be clear, the future of NATO isn't just about Europe. It's about the global balance of power. It's about whether the world stays stable or spirals into chaos. Because if NATO collapses, here's what happens next. Russia pushes beyond Ukraine, threatening the Baltics, Poland, and beyond. China becomes the world's dominant power, shaping global trade, military alliances, and even the internet. America, isolated, no longer leading the free world. We are standing on the edge of a new era, a world where democracies must fight to survive, where authoritarian regimes are gaining ground, and where the choices we make today will define the next century. So the real question isn't just about NATO, it's about all of us. Because if NATO fails, if the world's strongest alliance crumbles, then the question we must all ask is, are we ready for what comes next? The world is shifting, alliances are changing, and NATO, it stands at a crossroads. Will it adapt and grow stronger, or will it crumble, leaving a power vacuum that rivals like Russia and China will rush to fill? One thing is certain, the decisions made today will define the future of global power. So what do you think? Is NATO still the world's strongest alliance, or is it already falling apart? Drop a comment below, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe. Because in this battle for global supremacy, knowledge is power.